Hello, I'm Ollie, and this is Criminolly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, being Sunday, I'm going to talk some bollocks, and today I'm going to talk bollocks about publishers lying to us. So that was a deliberately inflammatory opening, but there is a grain of truth in it. As always with these Sunday videos, I've kind of got an idea of what I'm going to talk about, but we'll see how it goes. So you can let me know in the comments whether you thought this really was a load of bollocks or whether you thought I had a point. So what I wanted to talk about was deliberate deception by writers, by publishers about the identity of the writers they are publishing. So this, it seems to me, is something that's quite prevalent in the publishing industry, and I think sometimes there are legitimate reasons for it, and other times it's marketing, and other times it goes a bit further than that. So I've got a few different examples to talk about, but in a nutshell, this is the genesis for this was a conversation I had in the comments on one of my videos with Troy Treadup. Oh, and hold on. So let's give a shout out to Troy. So Troy is the author of this book, The Forsaken Boy, which is a werewolf novel I'm hoping to read soon, which looks very good. So thank you for this, Troy. On my video where I did my big book haul with lots of trash in it, one of the authors in that was VC Andrews, Virginia Andrews, and I questioned in that video why it is, this is going to be complicated, why it is that in the US she's marketed as VC Andrews, whereas in the UK she's always been marketed as Virginia Andrews. And Troy said he thought he had an idea about it and went off to talk to, I think it was his sister, who's a big VC Andrews fan. And the answer that came back was, in the States, publishers felt that for Flowers in the Attic, which was her debut, that it would be better to have a gender neutral name, so a name that obscured the fact that she was a woman, and so went with VC Andrews rather than Virginia Andrews. This is kind of doubly ironic in that she, obviously, her books, so she died, I can't remember when she died, but she died after about publishing, say, 10 books or something like that, and there are now dozens and dozens of books with the VC Andrews name on the cover, which are in fact written by a man, so they're now written by Andrew Needleman and have been for a few decades now, I think. And also, the other thing that amused me about it is when I looked VC Andrews up on Wikipedia, her initials were actually CV Andrews. I forget now what her first name was, but Virginia was her middle name. So that's an example of publishers changing or tweaking the name of the author in order to give the book, in their mind, broader appeal. Yeah. Another similar example, and another one that's laden with irony, is J.K. Rowling. So I didn't appreciate this, but J.K. Rowling was originally going to, publish Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, or Sorcerer's Stone if you're in the States, as under her name Joanne Rowling. But the publishers decided that for that kind of book, they would get a broader audience by publishing it with a gender neutral name. So they went with J.K. Rowling. Obviously, any discussion of J.K. Rowling and gender nowadays becomes fraught with danger. So I'm not going to go there. But it did seem very ironic to me. And also, clearly, it's very ironic that the books she writes now, the crime novels, the Cormoran Strike novels that she writes, are published under the pseudonym Robert Galbraith. So she seems to have a loose relationship with her own gender, despite what she might think about other people's relationships with their genders. So that's another example. Another one that's probably quite in tune with the channel, albeit I'm not particularly a fan of this author's work, is Riley Sagar. So Riley Sagar writes kind of, I almost want to call them YA. They're not YA books. They are books for adults, but they're similar to YA in that they're quick and easy reads, and they kind of straddle the crime and horror genres. I'm trying to remember the one that I read. I've read one of them, and it was okay, but it wasn't quite what I was expecting. I think it was I think it had the the words "final girl" in the title, but yeah, it wasn't really horror. It was more crime than horror. Anyway, Riley Sagar is one of those vague names that you can't really tell. You can't really tell much about the owner of that name. And Riley Sagar's real name is Todd Ritter, which is such a such a male name, but just such an American name as well. It's just, it just speaks of Middle America, doesn't it? That name, Todd Ritter. So the publishers, knowing that kind of thrillery book is very popular with female readers at the moment, deliberately came up with the pseudonym of Riley Sagar to publish these books under, to give them more appeal. So another example of where publishers are being deliberately economical with the truth about the author of a book for marketing purposes. Yeah. So, and I don't know where I stand on this. So part of me thinks that it's almost part of the appeal, or it's part of the experience of reading a book, is having a perception about the author. So obviously this is something that goes way back. And when you go way back, there are much better reasons for doing it. And it's interesting that, Riley Sagar, as one example, is an author where the publishers have taken a male author and made them appear female. Obviously, some of the most famous examples of this are the reverse. So, the one that immediately springs to mind is George Eliot, who was a woman who didn't feel like she was going to get her books published if she published them as a woman, so adopted the pseudonym of George Eliot. And Middlemarch is still a much adored classic today, hundreds of years later. Another really good example, and there's a great quote for this one, is James Tiptree Jr. So James Tiptree Jr. was a science fiction writer whose real name was Alice Bradley Sheldon. So Alice Sheldon had been a critic and an artist before starting to write science fiction. And the quote I found about why she adopted that name is fantastic. So this was in 1967 she said this. Oh no, sorry, she said it in 83, but she adopted the pen name of James Tiptree Jr. in 1967. So in an interview she said, a male name seemed like good camouflage. I had the feeling that a man would slip by less observed. I've had too many experiences in my life of being the first woman in some damned occupation. So again, it's about getting past prejudice by adopting a male name rather than having a female name. And it's something that I kind of think about quite a lot, because a lot of the books I read are, and a lot of the books I talk about on the channel are, I would suggest, stereotypically male books. So crime, I think, is one of those genres that's always been a mix. But I tend to talk more about hard-boiled crime, which I would say is definitely a male genre. There's a lot of the trashy books I talk about, so like The Survivalist and the Executioner books, are, the name for that subgenre of book is literally men's adventure. So definitely a male type of book. And horror, I think, is getting a lot more diverse. But traditionally, I think has been more of a male genre. And if you think about the authors that were really big in the 70s and 80s when I was getting into horror, largely men. And I did something. So a while ago, I looked at this was, I think, 2018. I did this. So I took a look at all the books I had shelved on Goodreads as having read them, and I think it was like over 80% of them were by men. And a large part of that is down to the fact that my two favourite authors, or the authors that I've read most books by, are Ed McMahon and Stephen King. Sorry, my mind went completely blank there. And I think if I think when I did the maths at that point, if I added up the books I'd read by Ed McMahon and the books I'd read by Stephen King, and I think if I threw in Clive Cussler as well, who's another very male author that I've read a lot of books by, I think those three authors I'd read more books by than I've read books by women. Yeah, so I gravitate to male types of books. I like spy thrillers. I like hard-boiled crime. I like horror. I like men's adventure stuff. So that sort of stuff tends to be written by men. What I actually ended up doing in 2018 was only reading books by women for a year. So I did a whole year where I only read books by women, and it was fantastic. It meant I couldn't read any of McMahon or any Stephen King, but I read loads of really good books that I probably wouldn't have got to otherwise. So it was certainly a very worthwhile exercise. But since then, I've gone back to reading whatever, and I haven't looked at the stats, if you like, but I'm fairly confident that I read. I probably read 70, between a 2/3 and 3/4 of the books I read by men, because that's the kind of thing I like. And I think that's fine. I don't think we should be ashamed of reading, reading one type of author more than others, as long as we're aware of it and we occasionally I will deliberately try and branch out a bit. But anyway, I'm getting completely off the point here. So the question then is it okay for publishers to be deceptive about the identity of the authors they are publishing? So obviously, pseudonyms are really common in fiction, and they're not always about swapping gender or obscuring gender or anything like that. So Stephen King, for example, published a load of books as Richard Bachman, and I think the reason for that was they weren't considered by the publisher to be quite good enough to be published as Stephen King books, but they still reckoned they could make a buck out of them. So that's interesting, isn't it? Because that's a very commercial decision. They decided not to dilute the Stephen King name by publishing these books as Stephen King books, and maybe there was something as well about Stephen King's an incredibly prolific author, and I suspect that publishers want to publish a certain number of books, and it's probably like one a year or something like that, by an author. That's probably about the right kind of rate that they like to publish at. So if an author's writing more books than that, and they still want to publish them, they need to find another way to publish those books. And in the case of Stephen King, they did that by publishing them as Richard Bachman books. And I do wonder what led to the decision then to republish them as King books. And I wonder if, I'm trying to remember when the Bachman books, like the edition with the 4 in, came out, and I think it was mid to late 80s, and I wonder if that's when King was going through particular problems in his private life, and maybe his output was slowing down a bit, or maybe he was just writing longer books and that was slowing him down. But yeah, maybe the publishers at that point felt the need to be able to push something else out with the Stephen King name on it, and so they published the Bachman books. So another example. So this I think is a more extreme example, and therefore a more interesting one. So this is the book Go Ask Alice, which was published in the early 70s and was later made into a movie, which I believe had William Shatner in it, which is brilliant. So this is a book that is the true diary of a 15-year-old American girl, normal American girl who fell into drugs and I think kind of sex work as well. So, a shocking expose of the life of, what's happening to our teenagers in America in the 70s. And, published to some degree of acclaim and a lot of, fame. It was, I think, a very popular book when it came out. And as I said, it was filmed. Of course, the problem with it is that it wasn't actually the real diary of a 15-year-old girl at all. It was marketed as such, but it was actually written by a woman who was, I think, a psychiatrist. Who wrote a number of other books, in a similar vein afterwards. But yeah, published as being by anonymous, and I think to this day it's still published like that, despite the fact that it's openly known now that that's not true. So that's maybe a more extreme example where it's not just about marketing. I mean, it is about marketing, isn't it? I suppose, but it's a more extreme version of marketing. But again, it's about that experience, the experience of reading that book, believing it is true, and it is the true example, the true account of the life of a teenage girl going through horrible times, is very different from it being a made-up story written by a psychiatrist, which probably draws on, I have no doubt that it draws on real stories she heard from real people, but it's not the same thing, is it? So as readers, how do we feel about that? Do we buy into it because it's part of the experience, or do we not like it? Do we not like being deceived? And I can't figure out exactly where I fall on that. Part of me kind of loves the idea of stuff being published as true when actually it's made up. there's something kind of innately trashy about that I quite like. I think another really good example of this outside of the world of publishing in movies is the Blair Witch Project. So when the Blair Witch Project came out, whenever it was it came out, late 90s, by the time it came out, certainly by the time I saw it, when it was, you know, really big, everyone knew that it was a movie, yeah, that it wasn't real. But when you're in the cinema watching it, it's so well done that it sucks you into that, you know, it sucks you into that idea that it is true, that it's a real documentary, that it really is found footage. And I think it did that brilliantly. And they kind of, you know, they played on that a bit in the marketing. So whilst everyone knew that it wasn't actually real, they wanted you to kind of take that idea in the back of your head when you went into the cinema that maybe it was real. I think that's an example of something that did it particularly well. But yeah, so let me know what you think in the comments. In terms of publishing, does it wind you up when authors change their names in a way that is designed to give you a different impression of the book when you see it on the shelf, to give you a different impression of the book when you pick it up and start reading it? I'm just going to look at my notes, such as they are, to see if there were any other authors I want to talk about. No, that was it. So yeah, so let me know what you think in the comments. I've really got mixed feelings about it. I find it. I always enjoy it when I find out that an author isn't who you think they are. And I don't know. I don't think, when I'm reading a book, typically I don't think about who the author is. But I think it would be an interesting experiment. And MJ from Reading This Life and I were having a chat about this. So could you, what would the experience be like of reading a book completely blind? So not knowing anything about it. So not knowing who the author was, not knowing what the title was, not knowing what year it had been published, not knowing what genre it was going into it. I think that would be quite an interesting experience, and I'm keen to figure out a way to try that out. I've got some ideas which I'm kind of bouncing around in my head, but I'm going to have a bit more of a think about that, see if I can come up with something. Anyway, I'm digressing again. So yeah, let me know in the comments what you think about publishers tweaking the names of authors for marketing purposes. Do you feel deceived by it? Do you think it's fine? I'm really interested to see what people think about this. Anyway, as always, thank you for sitting through my bollocks. I hope you're all safe and well. I hope you're really good stuff, and I will speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.